Hey YouTubes, I've been procrastinating on this one for a long time. I got a set of injectors here from STM Tuned. These are Fuel Injector Clinic 850cc injectors. Sure, if you've been following along, you know that I have RC 750s in this car right now. I went with RC originally because I really trusted the brand. It did fantastic when I used 550cc injectors back in the day in the GSX, and I had great times and it performed wonderfully. And they were rock solid with the known settings. But the problem is with the 750cc injectors, there's no information about global or dead time settings anywhere for the fuel. So I went ahead and picked up a new set. These 850s are very popular and a lot of people already are tuning with these, and global and dead time settings are very well known. So they come already loaded with the injector seals pre-installed, as well as the isolators, which is these little rubber padded pieces that keep them spaced properly in the fuel rail. And I bought 2 extra sets just in case, because you can never have too many of these. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull out these old RC 750s, swap these 850s in place, and change my ECU settings to try to clear up a problem with the ECU.
It's really not a problem with the ECU at all. The ECU I have in this car just gives me some really powerful observation tools, so naturally that's where I'm able to observe the problem. This log is from before I rewired the engine harness from scratch. That repair fixed every last electrical issue this car ever had except for whatever kind of noise this is in my air-fuel ratio. That thick gold line with all the jagged things all over it is AF ratio EST. That's what the ECU thinks it should have for an air-fuel ratio. And it shouldn't have all those jagged things all over it. Because I could find zero information on these RC750's dead time, global, and voltage offset values, basically the things that help the ECU generate an injector pulse width, I figured that this noise had to come from calculating things that were out of range. That noise gave me a lot of problems tuning it, and that's an understatement. I ran out of ideas chasing down the cause. That I'd start by replacing the oldest parts that I know the least about that are associated with that. Which is where these FIC 850s come in. These are not only well documented from the manufacturer, they're also well documented by the communities of the people who use them. They're the ones that I could find the most information about. I was running out of injector duty cycle with the car set to kill and the water methanol system on full blast, so that extra 13% more fuel that the FIC 850s provide is a good thing for me anyway. This whole job took me under 50 minutes, and that's only because I packed all kinds of extra crap in the way of doing it. Normally, you just need a 12mm wrench and a pick to do this whole job. I'm sure you can find reasons to use other ones, but in my case, I also needed an AN wrench because I installed AN adapters to make removing the fuel rail easier. Swapping the injectors out should be a breeze with it removed. Cleaning here is optional. As long as the seal bosses are clean, you're good. Nobody's ever going to need to get this close to this car before forming their opinion about it anyway, so why bother? You have to either drop something in the engine or bleed on it before you're finished.
Oh, I dropped the thing.
There you go. Let's see what happens if I just fire it up.
Let's try putting the right fuel settings in it, shall we?
Like my example just showed, with enough fuel you can put a fire out. That's normal. Your car isn't going to have the slightest clue which injectors you just installed on its own, and that's the way she goes. The ECU is going to deliver an injector pulse custom tailored to the injectors that it's absolutely positive are supposed to be there. It doesn't care if there's something else. Aside from a few hacks, you're going to need better tools to compensate for the new flow rates because it's pretty stubborn without a programmable fuel system. My weapon of choice is ECM Link because of the Turbo DSM engine platform. The fuel tab is where you would enter your global and dead time values. The global value is based off of the flow rate of the factory injectors operating at a given pressure, meaning that both the global and the dead time settings would be 0 if you were using the factory injectors. We'll just plop the known settings for the FIC 850s right here, and how'd I get these values? ECM Tuning maintains a wiki page full of many popular and even unpopular brands of injectors, and it includes their baseline global and dead time settings for 1G and 2G baseline fuel pressures with ECM Link. Neat! There's my FIC 850s right there, and that's where I got the settings. And down here on the bottom you see we have my original old RC 550s, but no 750s. Nobody loves the 750s, not even me anymore. I quit those. There's a lot more on this webpage about E85 stuff that doesn't really apply to this video, but if ECM Link applies to you, and so does E85, go here and check it out. To get the most from your newer, larger, beefier, non-stock injectors, I'm starting with the instructions. Fuel Injector Clinic provided the flow test datasheet that includes my actual injector dead time offset values for these injectors operating at different voltages. Those are important numbers, and I'll expand more on that later, but for now, we just need to get all of these dead time values into ECM Link where they belong. This isn't going to be lightweight material, but I know that my viewers won't mind that. Not everyone uses ECM Link, but the concepts demonstrated here would be the same on any other tuning platform as well. So for those new to EFI tuning, I'm going to start with some basics first. There's an electrical pulse generated by the ECU that's intended to represent a calculated volume of fuel. There's also an actual result that happens in the exhaust from burning that fuel. This can be accurately measured with a wideband oxygen sensor. So it's sort of like my story, her story, and what really happened. If we want to get her side of the story straight, we can always read the ECU and check the exhaust pipe to see if they match. And if it doesn't, we'll discover the issue somewhere between her fuel trims and her duty cycle. The amount of time that the ECU thinks the injectors remain fully open is referred to as its duty cycle. So from here to here. Duty cycle, represented as a percentage, is the time that the injector spends fully open versus time spent fully closed. Dead time is the time spent opening and closing the injectors. Fuel happens during the opening and closing events. The opening and closing events are typically linear, so the ECU easily calculates its volume of fuel based off of its duration and how much time the ECU thinks that takes. And this is where you come in. You have to change these settings. You have to tell the ECU how much dead time your new injectors need. Though all of these events combined take only milliseconds to occur, it only takes the ECU getting the injector pulse width wrong by a dozen or so microseconds in order to throw off your actual air-fuel ratios. So this step is kind of important. These aren't things that it knows how to do unless you tell it. The injector pulse width duration is duty cycle plus its opening dead time. I know the math is so much more complicated than that, but this isn't a real oscilloscope either, remember? As far as the electrical pulse is concerned, that's the duration of time that the ECU grounds the injectors for to produce a calculated and theoretical volume of fuel. The ECU is going to estimate the fuel delivered on the back half of the dead time, but you have to give it the dead time values up front for it to get any of the injector pulse width stuff correct. Under normal circumstances, your voltage and your fuel pressure are all over the place, depending on whatever you're doing at the time. Whether you're doing it in a straight line, uphill, downhill, in the sun, sleet, snow, or rain, however fast you're going, and however many decibels your subwoofers can generate, and at what frequency while you're rolling down the road. Everything you do that puts a load on your car, either electrically or mechanically, affects the amount of fuel that your injectors will deliver. Whenever your set fuel pressure increases, the solenoid valve in your injector has a harder time opening against that added pressure. That additional pressure will affect your dead time. That's why the first and second generation DSMs require different voltage offset dead time settings for the exact same set of injectors. It's because they operate at different baseline fuel pressures. Also, because the injectors draw their power source from the same power supply as everything else on the car, whenever whatever condition alters your car's electrical voltage, it affects the amount of current available to your injectors. If your voltage drops, dead time increases, and you'd go lean if your ECU couldn't compensate for it. You'd go rich if your voltage spikes because it's a hotter signal to operate the solenoid with. If your ECU is not compensating for those changes in your injector dead times, well then, your fuel trims are also going to be all over the place. Things like signal blinkers or windshield wipers can send you lean if you don't compensate for it. But this is where things get just a tad tricky. The voltages in ECM Link don't quite line up right with the voltages provided by Fuel Injector Clinic. This is totally not a problem or a feature request for either party. You can easily make a spreadsheet like this one that contains all the voltage values, and it estimates the ones in between and beyond. It'll at least give you the odd and the out of range voltages once I feed it the formulas, so anyway. Note that ECM Link uses microseconds for the injector offset values. I'm clarifying this because the voltage offset provided with my injectors are in milliseconds, so you just move the decimal place 3 places to the right and that turns them into microseconds. I filled in all the provided values and now I'm going to write the formulas to calculate the blanks. This will give me enough data to fill out and fudge the requested dead time values into ECM Link. This was my quote-unquote scientific method. The first value I needed, the 7 volt value, is out of range from all the other data I have, so I'm going to write a formula to split the difference between the 8 and 9 volt values below it, and then add it to the 8 volt value. It won't be perfect, but it'll be close enough once we finish the rest of the formulas. For the results in between the provided even values, I just split the differences between the one above and below it and added the difference to the one below it. It sucks to talk about nerdy mathy things on video, and you can copy my formulas here if you ever have the misfortune of having to do it this way, or you can do it on paper and pencil using a method that a guy smarter than me figured out that's linked in the description below. This is just how I did this. For the final result, which you don't really even need, I did basically the same thing as I did on the first calculation, except I divided the difference by 2. Maybe 1.6 would have been better, but either way, it's irrelevant because there's no 17 volt value in ECM Link anyway. It actually just goes to 19. So just fudge that one. I'd be surprised if your electrical system survived for very long at that voltage anyway. You can see that this part is easy. I transfer all the offset values that I have from the spreadsheet into the voltage fields in ECM Link. The 7 volt value is way higher than the range of adjustment, so I just have to set it to maximum. The way I just calculated the gaps simply gave me all the numbers that are close. It's typically a curve, so you know which values you were provided with and which ones you need to clean up. Additionally, just like I described, the 19 volt value is going to be a guess anyway, so just note the shape of that curve. Clean up all the stuff that's out of range and save it. If you have your specific known injector offsets, get this part behind you first because it'll affect everything else you do. You get to tune the rest of your fuel settings around this. Yeah, I suppose I could have done this without the spreadsheet. Of course, before you fire up your car and start tuning, you should make sure that your fuel pressure is actually set where you've told the ECU that you have it in your fuel settings, and that it's boost leak tested. I did all that previously before I disturbed things, and it was good then. Who knows if it is now, but I'm going to go ahead with it. Let's start this thing up and see where we're at. Don't let all these lines and numbers overwhelm you here. It's just all the things at once, and we don't need all of them right now, but I'm going to talk to you about some of them. Airflow per rev should normally be around 24 to 26, and you can see here that it's up in the 30s, and it thinks that there's a whole lot more air than there actually is. Combined fuel trims also says this. It's pulling out fuel like crazy. Just like its name suggests, combined fuel trims is the short-term and the long-term fuel trims combined. Crudely explained, low is idle, mid is cruise, and high is when you're really mashing on it. Your short-term fuel trims continuously sweep back and forth, cycling rich and lean around a desired target, and it checks itself against the cycling of the O2 sensor. If the O2 sensor stays too rich or too lean for too long of a period of time, then that short-term value gets moved into the long-term fuel trims that represent the condition that that engine is operating under at the time. But that's only when it's in learn mode that it does that. Tuning anything before the engine is warm or in closed-loop learn mode is pointless because the LTFT values stay locked. I put a link in the description for the conditions that have to be met for a DSM to get into learn mode. We're going to skip ahead though until the engine's warm. I've already pulled some air out of the VE table, which is the speed density tab in ECM Link. You can track your data log if you want to know exactly where your idle cells are, but I grabbed my idle cells and everything below it and pulled a few clicks out to remove some of the fuel. Here, when we switch back to the log, you can see that the airflow per rev dropped down a good bit. The combined fuel trims are coming down now, and the LTFT low is dropping too. The gold line on the log represents AF ratio EST, and the aqua line is my actual wideband oxygen sensor reading, which is LC1WB in the log data below. When you've got your fuel trims balanced, those lines should be overlapping and trading places right on top of one another. Since my airflow per rev is already so low, instead of taking air out, this time I'm going to take some more fuel out. And I did that by pulling more of the global because 0.22 grams per rev is pretty low. But looking back at the log, I see good things here. It looks like the LTFT values are balancing out. There's only one way to know for sure. Let's go take her for a spin. Okay, right off the bat, at wide open throttle, she goes lean and never recovers. 2 to 2.5 full points lean. I saw that happen on the wideband gauge while I was making the pull. Injector duty cycle is extremely low. I'll show you why this isn't going to work in just a second. The reason why I know it's the global that's off is because at wide open throttle from 5,000 to 6,000 RPMs, I want to be hitting my air fuel target of 10.8 to 1. And specifically when I'm doing that. And if I can't do that, then as far as I'm concerned, my global fuel setting is wrong because in those cells, under those conditions, I should be at 100% VE on my VE table. So the way I'm going to have to fix this is by correcting the global at wide open throttle until that happens, and then everything I do there will affect the VE table, so I get to completely restart my whole tune from scratch. I want to try to do something logical to explain how I'm coming up with my new global settings. Because I'm lean when I'm using known settings for the 850s, and because I have all kinds of duty cycle to spare, that tells me that my injector pulse width is too narrow. So if I tell the ECU that I have a smaller injector, it'll deliver a longer injector pulse width in order to deliver the right amount of fuel for the air that it thinks that it's reading. That will bring my duty cycle up. I'm going to assume that where I have it idling right now with the right airflow per rev near known settings is correct. My attempt to make the next logical step involves what I used to think was a problem with my old RC 750s. I no longer think that at all. My only problem with the RCs was that I didn't have good voltage offset data for them. That's actually something that I'm able to figure out, but I had to set those injectors as if they were only 594 cc's in order to hit my targets. That's a difference of 79.2% versus their supposed flow rate of 750 cc's. I think that it's just my car and setup though. I figure if I take my current global fuel value for these FIC 850s and then make that value whatever 79.2% of it is, set my global fuel to that, or as close to that as it'll let me, then that should be what I had to do with my old RCs. I hope. Because if it is, we get to save a whole lot of video. I'll have made my point and we get to go right on to the airflow tuning portion. If it's not, then I'll just keep adjusting global and go make wide open throttle pulls until I hit 100% VE around 5,500 RPMs. Once the ECU's requested air-fuel ratio is matching my wideband oxygen sensor when I'm at 100% VE at wide open throttle, then I know that my global fuel settings are correct. But for the dead time, I'm starting low and I'll work my way up from there. Dead time has little effect on wide open throttle tuning. I'll notice this more at part throttle and low throttle. We'll see what happens. But first, I hate everything about this. Notice it started leaking some oil, and it looks to me like it's, yep, vibration causing this not just to back out, but to egg shape the hole. It has egged it. I get no traction on that. So I think what I'm going to immediately do is an oil change and clean up all this crap. This isn't the only thing. I've got a blown axle too. It's just the boot. It's not the axle. But I'm going to get a pan under here, start draining this, and figure out what I'm going to do. I have two choices, and one makes me nervous. Actually, they both make me nervous. I don't like this. I've seen a lot of people crack this part, but I have the BSPT 1/8 inch tap for this hole. And it looks to me like I have a lot of thread left right there. So that galled part of the thread, maybe if I just tapped her a little wider and deeper, who knows, maybe I'll be able to save this and not do plan B. My plan B was to just run the NPT tap through it and use enough sealant cement to plug up the leak.
Yeah, we'll try it with the adapter first.
This is actually a lot worse than it looks. There's about 3 to 4 threads completely broken loose from the same vibration that caused this tapered threaded sensor to unscrew itself in the first place. So, for those who don't know, this car has solid window weld mounts for the budget conscious. Kind of unfortunate design flaw that the sensor hangs off of the furthest corner of the engine from the engine mount on an adapter, acting as a counterweight for everything that wants to wiggle it. If I were to do this again, I'd have at least tapped the oil filter housing for an NPT thread prior to assembly, just to take the leverage out from what that adapter provides. Who knows if it would be any less problematic without the adapter? I think it would stand a better chance anyway. I've heard that there are relocation kits available, and that makes sense. I dug everything I could get out of the hole and drove the tap about 2 threads deeper. We'll see if we can make these old parts grip.
Oh no, this is wrong. I feel like I need thread locker here. This stuff is gross. It ain't even mixed. Parts washer in a can.
It's pretty important whenever you're making a tuning video that you don't blow your engine because it vibrated your aftermarket oil pressure sensor out and spewed your whole oil pan at wide open throttle somewhere. So while I remedy my own brand of budget beater car problems, I'd like to take a minute to remind all of you that nothing is ever going to work on this car the way it says it will online or on any of your cars. And this is nobody's fault but mine. The top and bottom halves of this engine should never have been bolted together. This cylinder head was never supposed to have a turbo hanging off of it. It was never supposed to have a 3-inch cutout underneath it. Neither Mitsubishi nor Hyundai ever built a 10-to-1 compression turbocharged engine out of different parts off of their own shelves or those of their competitors. Everything about it's abnormal and it's perfect, just the way it is. Because now, since things didn't work out the way they're supposed to, you get to see how to fix this. If this happens to you, you can do this. There's a calculator built into ECM Link that works well for anyone to get to a starting point. It includes fuel pressure and flow rate compensation, but depending on what you've done to your car, you're probably going to end up somewhere completely different anyway. This is normal, especially if you're trying to tune your airflow to achieve 100% VE. It's also a fact that mosquitoes know how to wait for you to have to concentrate on something else really hard before biting you. I don't blame them though, I'm both delicious and ruthless. But I've also been known to fish at the drop of a hat, so I have the elixir that spares me from unleashing total annihilation upon them for the next 4 hours. I can't help that they love me, I complete them. I let the car sit for the thread sealant to cure. Left it up on jack stands to go through the cold startup procedure and to check it for leaks. I let it run for a good little bit. There's going to be no more leaks, I hope. Only one way to find out. Time to go test all my changes.
Daggone it. Here we go again. I thought it was too good to be true. One drive later.
Which one of my videos would be complete if we stayed on topic the entire time? Sorry to put you through this general maintenance kind of stuff right now. No matter how annoying this interruption seems, know that I left out the alternator tensioner bolt that vibrated out, 2 new accessory belts, 1 lower ball joint, a driver's side door handle repair, and the new windshield sealant popping loose from all the torque on the chassis. I'm in no mood to climb in and out of the passenger side door. I'm also in no mood to have to come back and do this again. I'm just trying to make a video of dialing in a new set of injectors, and we don't have time for this, so clearly I'm taking some extreme measures. This will suffice since the sensor is screwed into the adapter, and I'm permanently attaching the adapter. I can still replace the sensor. Call this one Plan C.
There. Maybe that'll do it. Maybe. Perhaps.
Now back to business. Oh yeah, I can work with this. You daggone right I can. Confirmed. You can see how the gold air-fuel ratio line and the aqua wideband oxygen sensor line up at wide open throttle now. At least it's really close. Let's see what it says at 5,500 RPMs. Yep, that's practically on top of each other. Let's check the VE table. Yep, right there around 100%. If I tick that up, it would probably correct it. Maybe it's a little bit off, but I can work with this. It's a good thing I was observant enough to figure out what the offset was based on a set of injectors that I dialed in previously with no data and knew nothing about. There's a lot of good explanations for why my global's messed up and why this happens to me, and why it could also happen to you. Nothing wrong with those RCs at all. I just needed bigger injectors, and this should solve that problem. This kind of global value is just what my particular car wants in order for it to get it right. It's a freak of nature, and I expect this from it. The ECM Link website clearly states that the global and dead time values provided are for both 1G and 2G cars operating at their default fuel pressures. Notice they're the same global and dead time settings. Well, I'm a 1G operating at 43 psi in this video, so everything for me was null and void right there. That's why there's a calculator built into its fuel settings tab. But I cheated by using what I already knew that seemed weird about my RCs, and it worked. Or at least this is something that I can work with. It's obvious that it needs a little bit more fine-tuning because it's rich most everywhere else in closed loop except for a few spots. I mean, look at all this. Look how high the gold is piled up right here. Let's see what else is wrong. You can see it knocks a good bit at the end right there. I had reset my timing table to an older one that had more timing in it, and it didn't seem to like that at all. Looks like here it is at wastegate pressure, less than 15 psi, making 350 horsepower at 6,150 RPMs, and 299 foot-pounds at 6,080. It's creeping up to about 17 psi in third gear right now because of how I ported my turbo. I've still got a few of those weird spikes in my air-fuel ratio here and there though. So, still to this day I have no idea what's actually causing that. Look, the map sensor signal, it's rock solid, so that spike in the airflow estimates is not coming from my airflow signal. Even BoostEst, which is hard to see because it's blue, is laying right on top of it. That's rock solid. That's the calculated airflow pressure laying over top of the measured airflow pressure. It's sort of like what we're doing with fuel in the exhaust right now. The RPMs are rock solid, no noise there anymore either. Speed signal? Not so much, but that shouldn't be at all related to any of this because it's mechanical and the sensor is cable driven. It really sucks. If you look at the AF ratio EST value versus my wideband oxygen sensor, that's really tight, showing me that not only the cells in my VE table, but the global value too is extremely close. That AFR estimate noise prevents me from accurately building an airflow table using any of the popular tools that are floating around out there that we're not going to even talk about in this video. Or even from me being able to get optimal results using ECM Link's awesome built-in tools effectively. It's because of this noise in the signal that I have learned to always build my airflow or my VE tables manually on this car. You get to see the method, the insane method of how I do this from scratch. There's a whole lot of information here that can tell me a lot about my tune and what I'm doing at the same time so that I can evaluate my actions prior to making common sense adjustments. This is called couch tuning, and it's exactly what we're doing right now. I'm just going to point out a few things for you to look at if you ever feel like doing the same. First off, tuning can be expensive, even if you don't break anything like I always seem to. My advice is that after you get your voltage offsets and global straight, focus on your idle, off throttle, and light throttle cruise values first because, well, stay out of it until you get those to behave because it's where your car actually spends most of its time. It's obvious that I'm narrating this after the deed is done, and I'll just let you know that I went through 10 gallons of 93 octane in 43 miles, partially because I did not do that. That set my lifetime inefficiency record at 4.3 miles per gallon average in mixed driving. I think if I focused on that first, I probably could have pulled off between 8 and 10 miles per gallon. Now that global's somewhere I can work with for this example, and before we get into VE adjustments, I'm going to show you some of the things the ECU uses to calculate its fuel. I didn't directly explain that we found our global fuel value by exploiting open loop mode, but that's exactly what we were doing. And this is the open loop max octane table. This is where your fuel targets come from when you're not in closed loop. The ECU pulls its AFR target straight from this table based on what it knows about its volumetric efficiency. This octane table is graduated by RPMs and load factor, which is basically the resistance load on a spinning crankshaft. If your calculated airflow based off of your VE table and your global fuel settings are correct, then the requested air-fuel ratio in this table should match what you're seeing in the exhaust pipe. The ECU is not correcting your fuel trims in open loop. It uses this. I'm going to detach this table and show you something. As we go through the jagged section, those spikes don't occur in the octane table. I'm sure that you're tired of me whining about this, but you'll be able to tell why this is frustrating to me. See that whole sea of 10/8 there? That's pretty much my wide open throttle. That's where that lives for me. But we're not going to mess with this table. My goal is to get the airflow right so that whether we're operating in open loop or closed loop, we're hitting our AF ratio targets. Once that happens, then there are reasons why you might want to adjust this octane table. Getting your injectors dialed in means getting your airflow counts right. You do that in your VE table. If you look around everywhere else in the log, you can see the gold and the aqua lines are all over the place, or they have huge gaps between them. This is demonstrating that the airflow table is way off of its targets. Some of it's normal when it switches in and out of open loop mode, but typically that means that the values in the VE cells are out of whack. Most of those areas where my foot is at part throttle, the ECU is operating what's called closed loop. In closed loop mode, the ECU relies on sensor feedback to calculate and adjust for the varying operating conditions that the engine experiences. It's constantly arguing over the VE table about the fuel trims and calculations and injector pulse widths, and then checking its math by sniffing the oxygen sensor. It doesn't get to do the strong-handed open loop command saying, "Do this AF ratio." Nope, that's what closed loop is all about. This is all that LTFT and STFT math. It's calculating the fuel delivery based off of your VE table. The VE table is graduated based on RPMs and air pressure. The numbers represent percentages of VE, or how much air a known displacement value can move. The first bar of air on this table is vacuum, so 14.7 is basically atmospheric pressure. Because you can add and remove air by changing these percentages, you're actually changing the fuel delivered when the engine is operating in whatever cell it's in. If you're tracking the log and moving through it, you can see where that's happening. So in a vague explanation, air is fuel here. As you drive around, the ECU samples from this table based on manifold pressure and RPMs, and whatever AF ratio est says at the moment is based on however accurate the number in that table is. If it's really rich, like most of this is, then I need to pull a few percentages of VE out of those cells to remove that fuel. If I find lean spots, well, then I'll add a few ticks. So once again, just like in finding global in open loop mode, AF ratio EST and your wideband signal are still your best friends. That's what you're going to use to tune closed loop too. One says do this, and what you eventually find in the exhaust is your result, a measurable result. But like I said earlier, depending on how much air your engine is moving at the time, the wideband sensor is going to read events a few moments later, and it's basically based on how far it's located from where that fuel is delivered. That's how much later it'll happen in your log. Before I go changing this table manually and doing this the hard way, I want you to know that most of you with ECM Link and speed density can calibrate your airflow tables and get really close to every single one of the VE cells that you've used in a log by using ECM Link's very own built-in tools. There's an SDVE adjust feature where your ECU compares the data in the cells sampled in your log, it compares them to your combined fuel trims, and then it suggests changes for you to save. I'll link the description for those of you who want the details about that. You don't have to fully understand how all of this tuning stuff works to get a nice solid drivable tune. It's what's really nice about it. But because of my AF ratio EST noise, I'm going to end up showing you the manual and difficult way instead, because that noise messes up its values that it calculates anyway. For the easy way, all you have to do is right-click the log, select SDVE adjust from the menu, and bam, it calculates all the cells you used in that log based off of your combined fuel trims. The results are right there in the VE table. It's not going to fix every cell, just the ones you used. You can do common sense things around where it made changes and clean up where you didn't use the surrounding cells, and once you're happy with it, save it. I still use this feature, and I did this several times while establishing my baseline because it can help you make major sweeping changes very quickly. This works for most everybody, but it leaves me having to clean up things that were already set correctly. It affects my fuel trims during the moments where that noise happens, and it's kind of annoying. I'm sure it's the car and it's not the ECU. I can't begin to explain to you how much this thing vibrates. It's probably from that, but the best thing I ever did for this car was to replace that engine harness. This is so much better now than it used to be. What I did for starters was to track my data log and place the VE table in the foreground. Now I'm going to assume that everyone who's made it this far through this video knows the difference between being rich and lean. To eggshell this, smaller than desired numbers are rich, larger than desired numbers are lean. The desired number we're going to use is AF ratio EST. The reason I use a gold line for fuel is because fuel is gold. It's a valuable commodity, and when it's on top, you're rich. When your gold line is below the water line, well, then my gold is lean, and I need to see more gold on that pile. If you hit Control and the up and down arrow keys, it lets you adjust the values up and down one tick at a time without doing any typing. It's convenient. You have to click the cell first, but what's not so convenient for me is that I have no point of reference to exactly where in the cell the ECU is sampling from, so I can't tell how the value's rated. But that's totally okay. This is a wonderfully accurate means of fuel delivery once you've got it all figured out. All you have to do is just be aware that the cells surrounding the sampled cell affect the value that the ECU is actually pulling from this table. Sometimes it will sample multiple cells like this. And that can actually help you more easily figure out which ones nearby are problematic. But whenever that happens, don't let that trick you into adjusting one that's already correct. If you made an adjustment to a cell with a good solid sample, and it's shared with one that's way off, try to fix the other one that's way off instead, You got more data here than just that one spot. You'll get to know certain cells as you revisit them frequently because of your driving habits. Also, try to avoid making changes to parts of the log where you're making medium to rapid throttle adjustments, because these will cause your car to run rich or lean during and shortly after the point where you've moved the throttle plate. So until that passes by the O2 sensor, in the early stages, consider that bad data. Just use the other stuff. The VE table is not where you make adjustments for that. There's another place to do that, and I'll show you later. Wherever there's a decent sample of area of a single cell while you're in closed loop mode, you also have another cool tool you can exploit in this. In closed loop, the O2 sensor is cycling up and down, and so is your wideband sensor. Just not in the same places at the same time. But you can select a length of time where it's in that cell, right-click, and tell it to display averages. The air-fuel ratio EST wideband results are now averaged in the data window below. This makes it easier to read exactly how many ticks you need to add or remove from that cell. Pretty cool, eh? It's easier than clicking the peaks of both values and remembering what each one said. It's asking for an air-fuel ratio, and all you have to do is just follow the gold. It literally tells you exactly what it wants. The default tables are good enough for you to start the car and drive it around, but they're going to require some adjustment for the sake of efficiency. Just know that it's telling you what it wants. It's important to know how the injectors work in relation to how the ECU puts its pulse width together so that you know how to give it what it's asking for. When you track one of these tables, it shows you exactly where it's getting the data from. And it doesn't matter if it's open loop or closed loop, it's always going to do it. But it's important to know what it's prioritizing and how these processes function so that you put your changes in the right place. The ECU calculates fuel based on air. So your airflow table or your VE table is indirectly also a fuel table. You can also look at your combined fuel trims for a second opinion of what's really going on, because it displays whether it's adding or removing fuel by displaying a percentage of fuel using a positive or negative value. So if you're ever in doubt, you've got something else that you can look at when you're in closed loop. You'll begin to see how the LTFT values are affected as more of the VE table begins to take shape. My goal is to at least get everything within 3% of 0. If you can make them all 0, congratulations, my friend. It takes a whole lot of time and testing to get to that point. But if you pull it off, it's a badge of honor. Wear it with pride. I got the RCs within 1% and was rather proud of myself for that. But I didn't do it without someone else showing me how to do this and failing a whole lot. I gotta say, thank you, Robert. Thank you. This video can't replace any of the documentation that ECM Tuning provides, and it can't give you the experience of doing it yourself. I read the wiki pages for ECM Link end to end, and they're flawlessly and expertly written. They always clarified every problem I ever had once I understood what I was looking at. There's also basically a summary in the ECM Link software on just about every page of the program that explains what all the stuff on the page does, and even a help section that's only one click away that you don't even need the internet for. Reading all of that stuff really helps. But what I needed when I started out was someone to help me visualize the procedure so that I could better connect the dots when speed density airflow tuning was new to me. If anyone learned something here, it's accidental. This is just my car diary, remember? What are you really doing reading my diary? Come on, get out of there, man. Once you're satisfied with the changes, save them to the ECU and go take a test drive to get another log. When you're gathering data, try to use as many of the cells and at different RPMs as you can. Remember, how you drive is what gives it good data to work with. Smooth driving yields the best data, especially early on. You'll find it necessary to drive out of your box in order to hit all of your cells. The more logs you analyze, the more your driving habits for tuning are going to change. You'll find yourself trying to keep your RPMs right on the zeros and 500s while cruising, using gradual throttle increases to avoid unnecessary fuel enrichment, sometimes even going the same exact speed in every gear. Stuff you'd never do otherwise, but you do it all because of how much more you can get done on each drive with a larger sample of conditions and data. You begin to recalibrate your butt dyno. You can even learn what running out of dead time feels like in the gas pedal on light throttle. With a reprogrammable ECU, there's no limits to what you can learn and experience. These are the things you only get a feel for and master with practice. But really, it's a lot of fun. A whole lot of cause and effect kind of stuff. A dyno is a big help if you're trying to get every single cell perfect, because they can be resistance loaded or locked at a specific RPM. You can hit cells that you'd never hit otherwise on a dyno, but you can do the same exact thing on the street and at the track without a dyno too. You can make just as good of a tune for however you're going to use the car, it just takes a little bit longer. And then you do it again, and again, and again, and again. My airflow table went through many rounds of changes, driving over a period of several weeks before I ended up with one that makes me really happy. Probably more than 75 or 80 logs. I'm not a master at this. I'm not a genius. I just have patience. If you look at these logs while scrolled out, you can see how the aqua and gold lines came together as I managed to correct more and more of the cells. This is great. Eventually you get one that looks like this. It takes a while for your LTFT values to change, so the process of testing and gathering data can take days of work if you're rebuilding the whole VE table from scratch. I typically try to spend at least 25 to 30 minutes per drive. I do most of this relying on the ECU to automatically switch between open and closed loop for me. Normally, it's the safest way to get most of the VE table done in my opinion. I've nailed most every cell in closed loop that I can now, but over a certain throttle position, open loop takes over. It makes precision tuning the VE cells a bit more like a guess at that point. If only there was a way to lock your ECU into closed loop. Well, you can. But the reason I do this step last is to reduce the chance of overheating. Wrong air-fuel ratios in closed loop with high RPMs tends to get things really hot. If you're running the correct air-fuel ratio in most of the rest of the table, then your engine will run cooler overall. So I get my air-fuel ratios tuned as close as I can before visiting the Open Loop Threshold tab in Direct Access. If you want to know more about these functions, then go read about it. This is just a thing that you can do. By changing the delayed and immediate load factors to 1.40, and I have no idea why I changed them all to 1.41, but it really doesn't matter. Anyway, the open loop threshold, changed that to 50.2%. There, I've essentially just locked it into closed loop operation. I'm forcing the ECU to read the O2 sensor feedback at higher throttles and higher air pressures and higher load conditions than it normally would. It's going to try to do the closed loop routine and all the math and everywhere I drive now, so with a warm engine, I fire it up with the new open loop threshold settings and then I go for a drive. I immediately noticed that it has a different attitude. It feels a little lethargic, and that's normal. Just keep an eye on your NOx sensor signal while you're doing this. Do not drive at high RPMs for long periods of time in closed loop. The best data will be gained from no more than half throttle in any gear, and make pulls up to your safe rev limit. This will give you all the closed loop data you want by doing this in first, second, and third gear, but you might need to make several tries after you review your logs and really get a feel for it. Speaking of which, let's park this thing and go back to couch tuning again and see what we captured. But first I'll show you, unlocking your ECU from closed loop is really easy. There's a double arrow button at the top that will toggle it back to its defaults. Turn your car off, turn the key back on, click that double arrow button, and then save it to the ECU. You can't update those direct access functions while the engine's running. That's just how it goes with direct access. Alright, on the couch now. I was going from reverse to forward right here, backing out of my driveway with traffic coming. A little aggressive on the clutch, I guess, but that's why it knocked. Moving on. You find the rich cells, pull air out of the VE table to remove fuel from the rich cells, find the lean cells, add air to the VE table to fix the lean cells. One thing that's different this time is that you get to find closed loop data all the way up to your red line if you manage to keep your foot out of it. You can see right here that I didn't, but just like what you've seen me do already before, you can still make adjustments based on this data. Why not? I mean, worst case Ontario is someday that you have to put it back. If you go over half throttle, it's just less accurate data because your ECU switches into open loop over half throttle with these settings. So don't do that. Here we are further down the log, and this is a spot where I did manage to rev almost all the way up to the red line below half throttle. Because of the air pressure where I'm sampling, I know that the data above these cells can also come down too. There are plenty of occasions where it makes sense to change multiple cells beyond the sample area. I made several other corrections because wherever open loop used to switch, I now have more data to work with to make my changes. Now, here we are getting closer to the end of the log. So you know what I'm talking about, eh? The end of the log? Anyway, I went all the way to the red line this time in closed loop under half throttle. Naturally, it took longer, so I got a sample at lower intake pressures, and this helped me clean up a whole lot of stuff above and beyond where I normally operate. Things you might see in one place where you made changes may be fine in a different spot, so you may question some of your changes. That's okay, you're the authority. You're supposed to question yourself. Let your car rest between episodes where you locked it in closed loop to gather data. Let it cool off. Make the best use of that data on your couch while it's cooling, then go save it back to the ECU, and then do it again. Repeat this as necessary to get the remainder of your VE table dialed in. Which I will. I'm going to do that. I'm really close at this point. The car's already running better than it ever has, but I saved the easiest part for last. This is the base tip-in throttle position sensor compensation. There's no other short series of words that describes this really well, but it's really simple. When your throttle plate is closed or it's barely open, the engine's pulling a whole bunch of vacuum. When you mash on the pedal, opening that throttle plate creates a surge of air that takes in an immediate impact on the next several engine cycles before your ECU can sniff and calculate the amount of fuel that's missing and squirt enough to compensate for it. So the result is that you'd go really lean when you open the throttle plate. Now, of course, the amount of lean varies based off of how fast you stomp on the throttle, and that amount of fuel required to correct it may vary. Instead of relying on the O2 sensor and the map sensor to respond or figure out how much air pressure there is, the ECU can use the throttle position sensor for some immediate input. So you go take a drive, and I actually did this process all along as I was working on my tune and fixing it as needed. But I'm taking this drive with default values to get a reference point to show you. Basically, you just drive and stomp, stomp, stomp. Do it from a cruise, do it in a high gear, do it in a low gear, leave your foot on it for a second after the stomp, let your closed loop settle out and stomp again. Hopefully you pick up on the fact that stomp can be a figurative term describing opening the throttle plate. You can trigger an 8 without an actual physical stomp, and all you drummers out there know exactly what I'm talking about. We'll check out the log in a second and compare a before and after. I could still benefit from further tweaks to these settings, but here are the values that I've changed already. I'm just going to save these into the ECU and then start another log for the ride home with what I've done so far so that you can see what it does. Same road, same techniques. You might be picking up differences between the before and after of what these look like even at this speed going by. If you're wondering why the air-fuel ratios aren't lining up in several places, it's because I just changed the VE table from the previous scene where we locked it in closed loop, and the long-term fuel trims haven't quite settled down yet. This isn't something you actually save for last. There's no consistency for the throttle tip-in between a value and a result here. Every injector will react differently to these changes that you make in the throttle tip-in table. The goal isn't to get anything numerically correct here. It's to make the delivered air-fuel ratio come as close as possible to the requested air-fuel ratio. You've got it right when the wideband signal matches the shape and general air-fuel ratio of the AF ratio EST value. Now that we're parked again, let's go back to the couch and compare these two drives. If you're operating a little bit rich or a little bit lean, you should still be able to see that shape take place in the lines, and here you can see I stomped. The engine goes full lean at wide open throttle, and it took a second before my air-fuel ratio went stoic again. That's the surge of air that I was talking about. The blue and gold lines are nowhere near each other in several places. If you look at the TPS delta value, that thin orange line, the value says 6. So what I'm going to do is show you the after value, how it compares to stock, and tell you that after 100 logs and dozens of changes, these values are where I ended up in order to get the after example that I'm about to show you to work right. When I did this, I estimated a point on each value for however many air-fuel ratio points the value was off. It doesn't really scale like that, but it kept my process and changes consistent until I achieved this result. Where was that 6? We need one from this log so you can see the difference. Alright, here it is. Look at this. Look where the lines go. Look how many samples pass between the throttle plate opening and a stoic air-fuel ratio. There's a stark difference between the before and after here. You can see the shape of the requested air-fuel ratio repeating in the wideband sensor a moment later after these throttle plates angles change. This is what you're trying to accomplish here. This is what prevents a potential knock storm when you're pounding on the gears doing rapid on and off throttle while shifting stuff, if that's your thing. This car is more sensitive to starting knock storms because not only is it turbocharged, but because it's 10-to-1 compression and burning pump gas. This isn't your normal turbo setup. Few 4G63s have a compression ratio this high. It's a full point higher than the non-turbos, and 2 more points higher than the turbo models. Some insist that you can't do this, but this proves you can. Things just might not work right, like my car's proving. You just have a narrower margin of safety in your tune when it's all said and done. I didn't touch timing in this discussion, speaking of safety, but this is where you can see the effect of compression on my car. Anyone who's spent time on this table with their DSM is already scratching their heads because this doesn't look like theirs at all. You can get yourself into big trouble real quick if you get this stuff wrong. My advice for your tuning is that there's typically nothing wrong with a factory timing table. Leave it alone. Get your air-fuel values to work right first. Don't play in here until you get your fuel trims correct. If I didn't have a tool like ECM Link to do this where I could change everything, then building the engine this way would have been pretty pointless. It would have been hard to tune. It's always been a knock factory, but this is what I had to do in order to fix it. Don't ever copy these timing settings unless you want a really slow car. Yes, my base timing is correct. Whenever you're dialing in a new set of injectors or correcting air-fuel ratios, I'd recommend paying a visit to the Dash tab of the ECU config settings and set the knock check engine light cell to only 2 degrees. If you get more than 2 degrees of knock retard, you'll see it on your check engine light, and that'll give you the warning to let go of your happy button. That's your safety alert with ECM Link. If you obey it, you're not going to hurt anything. I'm running out of dead time at extremely low throttle positions though, but otherwise this car's running better than it ever has. I love my new FIC 850s. In order to keep the injectors firing at low duty cycles instead of turning off, that means that I need to add some dead time and retune most of this whole table all over again. It's going to affect the result in the exhaust pipe from every single cell on the VE table when you add dead time or change global. If you address all the stuff that I covered in this video, then just like my car, after all of this, your car will run as smooth as mother's butter when you're done. You're probably not going to land exactly on the recommended settings either, just like I didn't, and I hope that I've provided a decent example of what happens and what to do about it if your car doesn't. You can use any excuse to drive somewhere and take a log, any reason. You'll use different cells you don't normally use when you're driving with eggs in the car than you will cruising down the highway or on track days. Whatever it takes to get the largest sample of data possible. Each previous log is a chance to go back in time to a time when it wasn't screwed up, but with enough practice, you'll get the hang of it. It's nerdy in a car kind of way, but it's fun, and you'll learn a lot about your car doing this. Please feel free to roast me in the description for everything I did wrong in order to get my car to run right. Click the like or the dislike button. I don't care, and YouTube doesn't either. To them, it's just a click. Like it or hate it, but please have an opinion and click one. Thank all you likers, thank you haters, thank you viewers, thank you subscribers, but most importantly, thank you Patreons for making all the time it took for me to compile this worthwhile. This is a lot to boil down and turn into a video, and I hope that it can help someone else. Please be grateful to all the kind people who put themselves out there to help others build their dreams. I've packed the description with lots of links to other people's awesome work and other information to help you with your tune, and they're all better examples than mine for this. I need to fix an axle before I start any more friction fires, but until that happens, stay tubed.